Hello and a very warm welcome to our event today here at Bruegel. My name is Guntram Wolf and I'm the director of Bruegel, and I'm really delighted to host you today, Margrethe Vestager, the Executive Vice President of the European Commission, responsible for many things, in particular responsible for competition and also digital policies. And today, today's event is entitled Autonomous, Digital and Green Europe. A conversation with Margrethe Vestager. And as you can see from these three words, autonomous, digital, green, we do want to talk about all these three issues. So the first one is autonomous, strategic, open autonomy. So there's all kinds of words for this, strategic sovereignty, European sovereignty. The second topic is digital regulation, and the third one is, of course, green and climate change, and what role for competition policy and state aid rules. So these are the three topics. The way we want to organize today's discussion is that on each topic we have 25 minutes roughly. We will always ask the Executive Vice President to kick us off with a few first remarks. Then one of my colleagues, always a different one of my colleagues, will ask some first questions, give some first remarks. And then obviously we do want to bring in you, the audience, the physical audience here in the room, so you get a chance to speak in the mic and actually ask real questions, not just type them on the computer. But of course, for those of you that are online, you can also ask questions, and you have to use the platform Slido. You go on Slido and type the code digital, and then I will be able to see your questions here and will be able to ask some of the questions to the Executive Vice President. Okay, so thank you so much again, Margrethe, for being here. It's such a pleasure to host you, and such a pleasure to see you also again in person after such a long time. I think the last time we saw each other was in the Commission and before at an annual meeting at a dinner, so it was wonderful to see you. It's wonderful to see you again. And so we want to talk first about autonomy, strategic autonomy. And perhaps you can kick us off with your first considerations on Europe's strategic autonomy and what role competition policy, state aid rules, projects of European common interest, etc. What is the role of the Commission in really advancing European strategic autonomy?
Well, first and foremost, in order to get the sound at a level that doesn't scare anyone in the room, because it's really great to be here. And thank you very much for the invitation, because I think it's... Are the sound people happy? I don't know. Remains to be seen. I'm happy about this conversation. I'm happy about the question, because for me, the drive that comes from competition is an integrated part of European competitiveness, of how to enable and promote innovation, and how to deploy innovative solutions. So a competitive market is absolutely key. Where we've had most of the questions asked is in state aid. That is what comes up. Some say, "Oh, why did you give up?" And when they say that, I feel really, really sorry for the state aid teams, because they have been working like crazy. Mm-hmm. First during the pandemic, in order to employ the temporary framework. Now during war and energy crisis with the temporary crisis framework. And the point is, of course, to say that we continue to enforce state aid rules, as it has been done for decades. And the rules of the treaty, they are as fresh as they were when they were written. I don't see any reason to change at that fundamental level, because time and again, state aid has proven its worth or the enforcement of state aid rules. Because what they do is that they prevent subsidy races, and that gives a level playing field. They protect taxpayers in the respect that they make sure that valuable public funding is not being wasted. And they have strengthened European competitiveness by making sure that when a business is competitive, it's because of doing business and not because of some politician thinking that they are to be politically chosen winners. And I do think that the temporary framework, the one we installed, I think 8-10 days after the breakout of the pandemic, that has been a success for two reasons. It is based on the flexibility that was already embedded in the state aid rules of the treaty. Second, because it respects the principles of minimizing distortions to the single market. And that is the key of state aid rules. And the reason why I find that to be so important is that we will get nowhere without the single market. We talk right now a lot about emergencies, but the fundamentals is still that European recovery, European resilience is built on a well-functioning single market. And this is why the state aid control has been so important to me. That being said, I think the subsidies that we enabled member states to pay out has been absolutely crucial. Otherwise, we would have lost perfectly healthy businesses that by state intervention had to close their doors, customers to stay at home, which is why I think it's obvious that damages should be paid. And second, it means that workers could stay on, workers that would otherwise have been unemployed, which means that we both prevented loss of competitiveness and social injustice. So I think those 2 points are crucial, and also because we have seen, because we are following the spending, that member states have not unspent each other. They have not used the pandemic as a disguise to promote some businesses here or there. We see that there is a relationship between spending and hardship, which means that measured by percentages of GDP, Italy and Spain are the ones that has spent the most. Just one more point to that, because now, tomorrow, the temporary framework will be gone, except for some of the investment features that will sort of soften the exit to make sure that we do not get a cliff edge. Now we have the temporary crisis framework, and of course the sanctions, they are targeted the Russian economy, but there will be follow-on effects in the European economy, which is why it's important that we enable member states to support businesses if that is needed. And also the wider implications of the geopolitical crisis, rising energy prices, general disruption of the economy. Here, the temporary crisis framework allows us to address that to proportionate, non-distortive, that's the point. And let me end with some of the fundamentals, because it's not just about crisis frameworks. Exceptional measures like these, they help companies to stay alive. But it is for companies to do business. There must be, crucial discussions in boardrooms all over Europe about how to change. Right. Because we've seen how supply chains has been disturbed. We see the lack of raw materials. We see the dependencies. But sitting, for instance, in the Compet Council and discussing raw materials dependencies, the dependencies were not created in the Compet Council.
No.
Dependencies, they are created by decisions in boardrooms, which is why there is a very close relationship between what is decided by the individual business and by industry as such, and how state aid rules can help out. And just to mention two things before I finalize, one would be the CHIPS Act, and the second would be the important project of common European interest, because these are key. And to some degree, I fear that they have become sort of poster childs for those who will say, oh, the end of state aid, what a relief. And actually, I'm a kind of person who hates to disappoint. But here I have to disappoint dramatically. There is no end to state aid rules. There's been no changes to the fundamentals. The CHIPS Act is facilitating private investment. It's not crowding it out, because there's no way that you can find the public funding that would facilitate this kind of investment. It's not doable. And there are strict conditions for investment under the CHIPS Act. The subsidy cannot exceed the funding gap, must respect sort of this first-of-a-kind condition, something new in Europe. And finally, it must contribute to secure the all-European supply of semiconductors. And, of course, be necessary, proportional, and done in an appropriate manner. And what we hope to be able to do is, of course, to balance the negative and the positive in order to see that this is indeed beneficial for the all European economy. And one of the things I admire by our founders is that they wrote a treaty that allows us to do this. We will change no single rule. We'll just use the treaty as it has been done before. And the same actually holds for the important projects of common European interest. Also here, what we can enable is that member states coming together take sort of the most excessive risk to enable private investment. And again, done with appropriate safeguards, I think this is really essential. One of the big projects that are ongoing already now is the one on the battery sector. And here our intervention reduced the aid amount by 1.7 billion euros, which is give or take 40% of the entire aid being given, while all the projects went ahead. And I think that is proven points to the beginning of my introduction, that we save taxpayers' money, that we make sure that when they are used, that they are being used in the most effective manner, and when taxpayers step in, that there is a pan-European effect to this. So hopefully these resources are spent in other worthwhile ways. We continue to do this. Also now we're in the process of assessing the two hydrogen IPCIs.
Wonderful for this. Thank you so much for this first overview. I think a lot of points that I think can be nicely promoted again. And one of them, for example, state aid. It's not the end of state aid. I think it's a very important message that, of course, it needs to be made very clearly, because the single market, with its proper competition policy and state aid enforcement, is the core of the European economy, and weakening that may well lead to more costs than benefits. But let me get first reactions by my colleague André Sapir, Senior Fellow at Bruegel. And André, I don't know if with a camera, if you have to step up here, or you make it from there. There's another camera. Okay, so you can make it from there, please.
Thank you very much for your initial remarks on strategic autonomy and the role of competition policy. I think you have partly addressed one of the questions that I had when you talked about the CHIPS Act. But I still want to pursue it a little bit. And this is about criteria. I think you were quite clear as to what are the rules of the game for going into this new direction allowed by the treaty, but maybe pushing the envelope a little further than it was before. You spoke as well about battery. Still, I would like to know whether potentially there are other cases. And again, maybe in a more specific manner, what are the criteria known for the sectors? I mean, you in a sense addressed the criteria for allowing and what amounts in a sense of state aid. But there's an issue of, which sectors, which products one is selecting. I think you already alluded to one of them, which is the novelty. The fact that we do not have production in Europe. No, we do have production of semiconductors. There's always a new generation, Every product has always new generation. So if it is about the fact that it is about a new generation, then potentially it applies to a lot of products. And so there I would like to to understand a little better, what has been the discussion, and are we to expect more new generation of whatever product that may qualify. That's one issue. Second issue, when you are talking about novelty and autonomy, it's autonomy in terms of production on European soil. But you already discussed the question of natural resources, of raw materials. Okay, no, there's no way that Europe can be autonomous in terms of raw materials, and for instance, to make a link to the third subject that we are going to discuss today, the green issues. We know very well that we may become more autonomous in terms of fuel, but this is going to require much more raw materials of a different nature, which we also do not have. And so autonomy, okay, we may be producing on domestic soil, but we still need to procure globally. And so where do you get the balance between the two? That is true for semiconductors. It's true for battery. It's true for any of those issues. So maybe I stop here, and maybe that's enough to get the conversation going. Thanks.
It's like Christmas Eve, because it's not always that people appreciate this kind of discussions over dinner. So I'm really happy with this, and it's an interesting point, because as you say, there is production of semiconductors in Europe. About 10% of world semiconductors, they are produced in Europe. The first important projects on microelectronics have produced a new semiconductor. Bosch is producing it. It's a rather big one, I think 26 nanometers. It's a power chip. And once the innovative process was ended, they themselves built the facility to produce it. So it's not a question about next generation. It's a question about facilities that we don't have. So it's about mega fabs, and it's also about sort of the business model of mega fabs. So what is imagined is, to a very large degree, to have sort of open mega fabs. Very often they would have a lead customer in order to take sort of first volume. But then they would be open for other customers who would come with their design, which is part of the CHIPS Act logic, because you'd see that what we're trying to promote in the CHIPS Act is also that many more European businesses, that they learn how to design, and that they integrate that capacity in their business model. Because being more independent, more sovereign, is also in the design phase, so not only in the production phase. And I'm all about recycling, and that also goes for Commission targets, because the targets of 20% of chips being produced in Europe was also set by Nelly Cruz when she was the commissioner back in 2013. Obviously, nothing happened, then we wouldn't be here today. And I think one of the reasons why it didn't take off was that the relationship with industry was not established. Now we have both the drive from the shortage. These projects will not solve the shortage because the lead time is way too long. But the fact that we can learn from the shortage, understand how it came about, and then try to prevent from that to happening again. Which means that the 3 projects that are being spoken about, they will establish production in Europe in a pan-European perspective to enable the increase of competence for businesses all over Europe, which makes this quite a unique situation. So we consider this an exceptional act to answer an exceptional situation. Also, I think it's a good case in point for those who are still having trouble to set open in front of strategic autonomy. Because if you want to be self-sufficient in semiconductors, the upfront investment is give or take 300 billion euro. If you had 300 billion euro, you consider if you would use it for this, but also you'd have to find the engineers to put in place, the value of facilities for 300 billion. Not going to happen.
No.
Is not going to happen. So obviously what we are discussing within the framework of the Trade and Technology Council with colleagues in South Korea, other places on this planet, is of course how to make sure that we will help each other out on a rainy day and days that are worse in order to make this happen. And of course that leads to the discussion about input. Because even if we get perfect at recycling, then we need much more. We need much more for batteries, we need much more for the production of semiconductors, we need much more for solar panels, for wind turbines. All of these things, they will need raw materials. I was just in Sweden, and I have never met a happier Minister of Business. Never. And ministers are normally not happy. At least not in Scandinavia, because we have complex political systems, you never have a majority, so days are difficult. This was a happy minister, because investment was pouring into the north of Sweden, where they have basically resources, everything you need. One of the businesses had been piling up what they thought was polluted iron ore. They've been doing that for 70 years. They thought maybe we should consider what is the pollution. And then it turned out the pollution was two critical raw materials that they have now started to take out of the iron ore. So no new mining, just looking at the material you had already. Norway also, case in point. We are talking with the Canadians, with whom we already have a close partnership. So also when it comes to raw materials, of course, it needs to be open strategic autonomy, where we try to find ways to make sure that we can get the raw materials where we want them. But what is absolutely crucial here is, of course, that businesses sign up for long-term purchase agreements. Because long-term purchase agreements is what enables investment. Because then you see the investment strategy. And this is why I say this about discussions in boardrooms, because obviously the price point may be slightly different.
Right.
Because there are reindeers to take care of, there are frogs, there are mice, there are people, there are a lot of considerations that we have in Europe and that we should have in Europe.
Well, I mean, of course, I do want to bring in one or two questions also from the audience, but to push you a little bit on these last points. I mean, obviously, you emphasize this tension between sort of autonomy and openness. I mean, or like the complementarity. Let's put it this way. So I guess one question for me is, which areas of the economy do you really identify to be the ones where we need domestic production, right? Because, I mean, one question here on Slido is about, what is the better aspiration, tech self-sufficiency, which I think is not possible, or working with partners in the rest of the world. So we have to take these all the time, these choices over a huge amount of different products, and decide, okay, you decide for chips is crucial, we need some chip production here. but there's so many other products that are crucial for supply chains where we don't have the production here. And so there it's the boardrooms that decide. So how do we get this right, this balance, and choose the right sectors where the state aid is going to be authorized, is going to be needed, where we need the domestic production, and where are the sectors where we don't need that? You see, I mean, there's choices that we have to take, and I wonder how you take them and how the European institutional system takes them. But perhaps before you answer, let me bring in one or two more questions from colleagues here in the audience. If you can just raise your hands so we have perhaps 3 speakers here in this row, second row. Well, okay, so yes, so and the lady there. So we take actually 4 questions, but you have to promise just 1 question and short, otherwise we cannot take 4.
Vestager, for this discussion. I work in just on state aid, so you can understand how I appreciate this kind of exchanges. My question is quite simple, related also to the point that you comment, is that do you think that during your mandate we can also discuss how to support with state aid the manufacturing industry that is dealing with supply chain on digital green Europe outside the assisted areas? Because in concrete terms, one of the big limits is that a government could grant the state aid, but assisted areas and with some aid intensity that sometimes could not enough according to the uncompetitive with some Chinese products. How, or could we start a discussion about this approach or new approach? Thank you.
And if you can also identify yourself and then pass on the microphone, sorry.
My name is Simonetta Naletto. I'm working from Enel.
Okay,
Thank
wonderful.
you.
Thank you. Perhaps you can pass on the the mic to please.
Hello, everyone. I'm Fotios Kaladzis from European Investment Bank, Economics Department. I have a question as well related to the state aid rules and also to the current energy crisis, because we see many member states taking measures in order to tackle the social consequences of the energy crisis. And at the same time that we have seen that the DGNR has published a toolbox, so in order to guide member states with the measures that they are supposed to take. But we see the measures, let's say most of the member states are providing fossil fuel subsidies that go against, let's say, our climate objectives. And then I was wondering whether the Commission has assessed or is assessing this thing. Because on the one hand, in the Repower EU, we say that we would like to have energy savings in order to reinforce our autonomy. But then on the other hand, we are providing subsidies, and we know that demand is inelastic, and we have to make them more elastic, let's say, in order to ensure security of supply. Thank you.
So this is an energy question which we might want to come back in the last section. Then we save that question for later. Niklas, please.
Hi, Niklas Potier from Bruegel. So my question is on strategic autonomy and the CHIPS Act. It's kind of the Commission is now assuming a new role in a way with the CHIPS Act, where it kind of sets goals that it wants to reach, but of course the Commission doesn't have its own resources to do state aid. So, and but on the other side, you're also the people that kind of then have to police the member states on the state aid, that this is according to plan. So I wonder, how do you weigh the two things? On the one hand, as an executive vice president, asking for these big goals, asking member states to give state aid, and at the same time also having to be the one that has to decide on these. Thanks.
Okay, and the colleague to the right, and then we...
Yes. Michele Pastore with Huawei Technologies, and I still have a question on the CHIP Act. A reflection, a very quick reflection, and a question. The fundamental of the CHIP Act were well understood. I mean, you also explained pretty well now. But there is maybe you're welcome. There is maybe one element that is missing, which is the demand. Obviously, the CHIP Act is not designed to look at the demand. So the point is, considering also that several studies already pointed out that about 30% of the European production on European soil of semiconductors is exported to China. And obviously, my question is going to be related to China. What the Commission intends to do, or what the Commission may think of in terms of protecting the supply chain, the European supply chain, in order to make more sense of these opportunities coming out of the CHIP Act, so in order to be able to sell also to countries or to companies that are now under restrictions of supply chain by other, third country jurisdictions. So how are we going to adjust to these new possibilities in the future? Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. I think this gives you a rich set of questions.
On Nicolas' question, this was basically the first question I had to ask myself when accepting the position as both Executive Vice President and Commissioner for Competition. Because there's no difference here than in anything digital, in any of the goals that we've been setting. Because it is the same. Having to police the state aid rules while setting goals, and of course that one wants to see that member states go there. One of the first things that we do, obviously, for instance, with the goals that has been set in the digital decade, is to make sure that there is member state ownership. This is because the Commission cannot impose that this is the way that you should go. There must be a member state ownership. But maybe more fundamentally, the character of the work within the competition portfolio is that it will have to stand up in court. Which means that we have the checks and balances. I have the independent advice from the chief economist, from the legal service, which means that what we do will have to be with the right legal framework, will have to be fact-based, will have to stand up in court. And that, of course, is what makes it, I think, not only easy, but also trustworthy to compartmentalize that these are two separate sides of the work that we do. And for me, actually, it's also personally quite simple, because I think that active, fair competition is one of the most important drivers to reach any of the goals that we set up. Aid is a helper, but the main driving force for innovation, for investment, for getting things done is fundamental competition. It is that the single market is working. So just a more fundamental answer to your specific question. On the question as to should we give operating aid to businesses in non-assisted areas? Why? If you cannot make your business in an area that is, that's growth, it's dynamic, you have been doing your business for a very long time, that would be unleveling the playing field in a way that would be very far away from the logic of the treaty. What is the logic of the treaty is that in assisted areas, of course you can do stuff, because cohesion and that the union should grow together, and that eventually we should heal. Also, when it comes to the gaps that we have right now, that is a matter of the head and of the heart. And I think it's really, really important to insist that, yes, you can give subsidies to establish productive capacity in assisted areas, because this is where it is absolutely needed, because then you compensate for maybe lack of infrastructure, lack of closeness to research centers, whatever it can be, in order to enable this to happen. I'm strongly in favor of being able to do so, because then aid and the other funds that we have available can be part of that healing process. And especially right now, because actually what we see is that the divides of the region, they are not shrinking. And we are even adding new ones like the digital divide. So I think it's really, really important that we insist that there are differences. That being said, there are ways to enable, for instance, research and innovation, But the point, and this is where the qualities of the single market comes in, is of course establishing productive capacity. On the question on how to choose where to invest, when it comes to raw material, already in the last commission under the leadership of Jean-Claude, we made the raw material strategy. So that gave sort of the knowledge and the insight as to what should be followed. And I think this is one of the reasons why you have this massive investment, for instance, in Sweden, as I just mentioned. Second thing is the analysis done by GD Grow. They started with 5,000 products. They scaled that down to, I think, 137. And they scaled that even further down to 34. In order to say which products are actually quite essential. And then analyzing this. But the most fundamental thing here is that resilience comes from having more than one customer and more than one supplier.
Diversification of supply.
And that is what comes with competition. That is what comes with market access, which is why, subsidies that will be limited, that will be temporary, they are no permanent solution to resilience. That comes from market functioning and diversification. And of course, it is thought-provoking that the day before the invasion in Ukraine by Russia, we were about to increase our gas dependency of Russia. Which also means that what we should in the future is in all parts of the value chain, also when it comes to fuels, also when it comes to raw materials, make sure that we get 5% there, 10% there, 17% there, 5% there, that also in the fundamentals, that supply is diversified.
Well, I can't resist making the remark on the energy dependency that it really is quite related, has been quite related in the country I know best in Germany to a merger that dates 20 years back, E.ON and Ruhrgas, that actually, because of the merger, increased the dependency on Gazprom, and which was, of course, a ministerial decision against the wish of the cartel authorities of Germany. So lack of competition is clearly one factor that drives external dependencies, and so I'm very happy to hear that. But I'm afraid we have to move to our...
I just makes me say that I have no good answer to your question about who can buy. But so far, we don't think that the projects that we have right now will lead to an oversupply, because we still think that it's within the framework of the give or take 20% that we hope to be produced in Europe.
Okay, so we have to move to the next topic, which is digital regulation. The European Commission, under your leadership, has of course driven forward a whole regulation agenda. You've passed the Digital Markets Act and other major regulations. They have been adopted now. So I guess perhaps you can give us a sense of where we stand on digital regulation. What's your first assessment? Has it been enough that has been done, and what should come next? Also, is it about implementation? What are the key next steps on digital regulation?
Well, in my experience, it's difficult to pass legislation, but it is 10 to 100 times more difficult to implement it and to enforce it. Because in passing legislation, we find compromise and we put that on paper. When we enforce, we change behavior. And no one likes to change behavior. Of course, we are forced to do it ever and again, but it's never something that comes easily. And both the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act will entail quite far-reaching behavioral changes for those who will be designated gatekeepers, for very large platforms in particular, when you look at the Digital Services Act. So everyone should look at enforcement. How can we make this come true? Because if we just move on to the next piece of legislation, then we take the risk of having achieved nothing. So this is absolutely top of mind. Ideally, we would see a high degree of compliance before any enforcement action is needed. After all, there is quite some time before full compliance is asked for, so there is time for designated platforms to adjust their practices. And of course, we expect that they will. Also because if you look at sort of the global picture, you see the changes in Japan, in South Korea, in Australia. There's a fair chance that things will happen in the US as well. The tide is turning. So instead of fighting every step, maybe better adjust, because we will enforce it. The logic is the same as when we placed the proposal in front of the co-legislators, that this is to protect citizens and small businesses. That being said, part of the digital rulebook is still under construction. Artificial Intelligence Act still to be discussed and negotiated. It will be a global first. So really important, of course, to make sure that it can be enforced. And all the other files that we're pushing, also they will have to be, get a real life. Goes with EID tomorrow, but that is more for the first part of this conversation. We have what might be, knock on wood, the last trialogue on the foreign subsidies proposal. But for me, it's really, really important that we focus on implementation and enforcement, because real life is never easy.
Okay, so clear message, we need to enforce what we have legislated. Let's get the comments by my colleague Scott.
Thank you very much. A real honor to have you here today, EVP Vestager. So thank you very much for these very thoughtful comments. And indeed, I would have been going with my questions in very much the same direction. We've enacted several really important bits of legislation now, but the implementation and enforcement are the next challenge. Mm-hmm. And it seems to me that we have a large number of acts that have just been put in place, a couple more still rolling down the pike, including the Data Act and the AI Act and EID. Also, more than 30 legislative acts as part of the digital single market in the previous legislative term. So first question would be, how do we ensure consistency of implementation in all of these new bits? First, consistency across all of the different functional areas that are entailed in these different bits of legislation. But then secondly, also consistency among the member states and between the member states and the European authorities. Typically, each of these measures has a different mechanism for trying to ensure consistency. They're not all the same, and a few of them, I would particularly call out the one-stop shop in GDPR. A few of them have had, I would have to say, mixed results. So really the question is, how do you actually get there? Secondly, I'd be interested in your thoughts on something that you very briefly touched on, which is prospects for international consistency of some of this digital legislation, regulation. You mentioned briefly the United States, but in areas like privacy, and as we know, we've got hopefully a replacement for Privacy Shield. We haven't yet seen exactly what it's going to be. There are other areas as well, like online content moderation and participation moderation. Really, how realistic is it that we're likely to get something between at least our most important trading partners, especially transatlantic? We have a TTC in place, an EU-US TTC. We just put an EU-India TTC in place. But at least from the outside, there's not a lot visibly coming out of those. So what do you see as prospects? And once again, I'd like to thank Andre for having left something under your Christmas tree. I hope I've made an addition, and I hope that you can return the favor. Thank you very much.
Yes, I will. And you know, these are the best presents because they don't have to be dusted, and there's very little CO2 footprints from this kind of Christmas presents. Recently, I asked one of my staff to map what is actually needed in order to implement. Of course, easy when it's the Commission who's the enforcer, much more challenging when it's member states. And what came from that mapping was a very nuanced, but also, as you're suggesting, a quite complex picture. The chance we have right now is that we will be, in a period of relatively few years, we will be implementing the Digital Services Act, Digital Markets Act, Data Governance Act, the Data Act, the AI Act, the EID, just to mention sort of top notch. But the fact that we'll do it within a quite short time frame can make it a good thing to have an implementation strategy to help member states to see how can we rationalize. Some member states, they have some resources, some have very few. And with an implementation strategy, maybe member states can better sort of say, what should we put under the same roof? What authorities could do more than one thing? As you say, in most of these pieces of legislation, there will have been coordinating bodies enabled, and having an implementation strategy will also allow us to cater for the rhythm of the advisory committees of this body of legislation, to have a rhythm that makes it obvious that they coordinate with one another. On the Digital Markets Act, you know that the common body will consist of more than competition authorities, which I think is a really good thing, because that will break down the silos between them, and also then, of course, inspire what one does in the specific of competition enforcement, or, for instance, in the telco enforcement as such. So I think it's really important to have a strategic approach to the implementation of such a big body of legislation. Of course, it sounds a bit crazy that you need an implementation strategy, but maybe as thought-provoking as the fact that I think colleagues of mine are developing an AI tool to find your way and navigate our funding possibilities for small and medium-sized businesses. It's just to say that when you are a regulatory superpower, you need to go to quite great ends to make sure that people can actually see what they are doing. So we don't just get a jungle, but that we get a system that can actually enforce, so we achieve the strategic targets that we set up, open contestable market, and for people to enjoy both free speech in the sense of the Digital Services Act, and that illegal things are being taken away. And the question of international coherence is quite broad. I think it is South Korea who in April put in place legislation that would enable, or well, both enable but also oblige to carry more than one app store, which is also one of the obligations of the DMA. So here there's full coherence. Where things becomes much more tricky is when it comes to online content moderation. Because as you will know, the Digital Services Act sets up mechanisms, but leave it to member states to decide what is legal and what is illegal. And that, I think, is a strength of the European system, because it caters for the differences in culture. You know, the Danes and the Swedes, they do not agree on what can be said and what cannot be said. That we have different gray zones. So I think that is a strength of the European system, because you see that some of the debates that they have in a US context, they zoom in exactly on this question as to who should moderate, rather than what we have been discussing, what should be the mechanism.
So So let's bring in a few questions and remarks from the physical audience as well as the online audience. So let me just read two questions that are quite related, and then we bring you in. So please already prepare your questions here. So one is by Robert Tyson, and he asks about how can the EU protect its strategic autonomy in the tech sphere, especially in terms of combating the influence of tech giants, without upsetting the US? And a related question is, how does the accelerating democratic backsliding of the USA affect the transatlantic collaboration on digital regulation? So this is, I think, one sort of set of comments or questions on the transatlantic relation in the digital sphere. But please, are there questions from the audience here? Please raise your hands. Everybody is exhausted by the regulation. There's enough. Please, can we get the mic here? Oh yeah, sorry.
Thank you. So many thanks for the very good explanation. My name is Almudena Diaz. I work for Enel as Simonetta. I'm following energy and digital policies. And my question is related to what you said regarding the implementation and the enforcement, that is not an easy task. And it's not an easy task also for what has been commented, the amount of digital dossiers that have been released, which we welcome in another way, because I think it's the right moment and it's very much appreciated that you put Europe fit for the digital age. But to these horizontal legislations, we have to sum also the sectorial rules and the upcoming sectorial rules. And on this regard, the policies or the energy sector, for instance, in my case, have been following energy dossiers since the beginning. And digital policies are a bit more difficult to follow, or a bit more difficult to understand for many of my colleagues. For instance, what is a trusted flagger, what is intermediary service, what is a connected object, and this we believe it could difficult implementation and compliance. So the question is, for all these sectors which were not dealing with digital policies since the beginning, are you willing to prepare some guidelines or some consistency guidelines between the horizontal and the vertical legislation? Thank you.
Yes, please, one more.
Yes, hello. Hi, my name is Margrethe from the BVA, also from a very regulated sector as here our colleague from Enel. In financial services, we have a similar problem. Actually, there's a question a follow-up question concerning enforcement. How do you see the role of some horizontal new agencies that might do the enforcement of AI or data or these new horizontal legislations versus the role of existing authorities, supervisors that we already have in.
But we heard you. Mm. And so let's there's one more question, if I may, from Reinhilde Vöglers, Senior Fellow at Bruegel.
Yeah. So you mentioned the importance of the implementation strategy, and definitely in view of the complexity, I was wondering, is there also an ex-ante monitoring and evaluation strategy in place to see whether things work or not? And then in terms of on what you will be evaluating, is there also enough checks on how innovation-proof the legislation is and what the impact would be on the new technologies, digital technologies could come about?
Well, I see there's even one more, if you allow us.
Very short.
Very short.
I'm Miguel Ceballos from Temasek. In all the comments made is about legislation that has a broad geographical impact, scope. All the digital acts, the foreign subsidies, they all have an impact worldwide. How to ensure precisely the implementation, when it's particularly done by member states, complies with our international commitments and WTO in particular? Thank you.
Wonderful question. And of course, there's one word that wasn't mentioned yet, and so let me mention it. It's China. I mean, China is, of course, we talked about, I mentioned the question on the transatlantic regulatory space and competition also on the transatlantic. But what about the relation with China in the digital space and how regulation affects it? I mean, where do you see that agenda?
Okay, buckle up. No, let me start with the question of evaluation. I think the important thing is that we need to get started. We will have an external eye, obviously, from the Court of Auditors, who are not only doing sort of old school audits, they would also do audits about do we achieve what we want to achieve. So of course we're very well aware that it's not just ourselves who will evaluate if we get to where we want to get. We also have this external eye. But we do not sort of start evaluating before we're actually there. But these are pieces of legislation that do not claim that they are sort of the end of our regulatory history. We will learn. We have tried to future-proof, for instance, the DMA, because new practices can come in as prohibitions and obligations via delegated acts. So, of course, these are things that will move in time. And one of the things that we have tried to refrain from is to regulate technology. What we regulate is behavior or the use of technology rather than this specific state of technology, because then I think it's a given that legislation will be outdated really, really fast. I think that is most obvious in the AI Act, which is about the uses of AI. So much more than about technology as such. And that, of course, makes evaluation a specific discipline because we will learn when we start implementing this. On the question of agencies and horizontals, if you take, for instance, the Digital Services Act, in the process of the negotiations of it, in my view, it approved. Council, Parliament, we in the Commission learned during these 2 years of time that went by. So we have the ban of dark patterns, we have the ban of targeted advertising for minors, but we also have the enforcement for very large platforms done by the Commission. And we try to balance to make sure that existing bodies, existing agencies, that they can take upon them roles. That goes for the AI Act as well, that the sectorial bodies who are dealing with it, they will have to deal with the AI aspects as well as what they did before. I know it is sort of first page on most sort of political textbooks, let's propose an agency. But we have a lot of agencies. We have a lot of bodies. And it's, in my view, much better than existing bodies and agencies integrate what are the changes in the sectors where they are the regulator or the authorities, rather than to have someone else that they will have to deal with. So this is the approach that we're trying to follow. And I think one of the reasons to prevent sort of new horizontal is that the Commission is enforcing where that makes most sense. Or if it's sectorial, then it is the regulators or the authorities that you would know already who integrate what they did before, what is new here. I think guidance and guidelines is a very good tool for the Commission. You know, very often in my area, what we use guidelines for is to bind the Commission. That we are bound by the guidelines that we make. We tell the world this is how we will do things. But we try only to do guidelines also for the outer world once we know what we're dealing with. So we need to get experience before we can do guidelines, and then next phase, hopefully, especially within the competition area, we can make a general block exemption regulation. We can GBERize it so that once we know, well, this is the recipe for doing stuff, then we distribute the recipe and say, go, go, go. You don't have to involve the Commission in what you want to do. So guidelines is something that we're very familiar with, but done with care so that it makes sense. But happy to hear if there are areas where you find that in particular guidance is needed. On the question of the outside world, how to do this without upsetting the US. Well, I think the basics here is that since this is not about the US, the risk of upsetting them, I think, is minimized. Because this is about the European market. This is about how technology works in our societies. And you can be US-based, you can be Chinese-based, you can be European-based. It's about your behavior here. And if you look at the Trade and Technology Council and the results that we have achieved so far, you would recognize in our common conclusions quite a lot of sort of the values, the direction that we are traveling in Europe. You'd find that with our US partners as well. That be to prevent a subsidy race when it comes to semiconductors, because we have had the first part of it's probably an urban myth, but we have had sort of the first rumors that businesses that travel the US and say, what will you give? And once they have a number, they come back to Europe and say, they will give this much. What will you give? And that, of course, make no sense. It doesn't give us more semiconductors. It's only a bigger cost for taxpayers. So here we have agreed on the principles, necessary, proportionate, appropriate. The US, they don't have state aid control. So for them, they have to approach it in a different way. Also, when it comes to platforms as such, you'll see that we see eye to eye on some of the issues that we have. They have a different approach, but in principle, the same thing. And on some of the more tangible results of the Trade and Technology Council, you'd see the work that is being done in order to have this early warning system about how to cooperate on standard settings so that there can be a bit of influence on the standards being set and that we can coordinate better than what we do today. And this system has been set up already so that it is functioning. On the question of how to make sure that member states, they implement things in accordance with WTO rules, here I am in the lucky position to say that Valdis will deal with it. No, it's of course he's much more and much better versed in the questions of the WTO. On China, I think that is to some degree an open question, because also in China they pass a lot of tech regulation right now. I tend to think that since they have a system that we consider a rival to our system, it's for a different purpose. And that, of course, makes it very difficult to compare. But we try to find ways to talk about it because it is important also to have a dialogue with China when it comes to digital. Also, in areas where we definitely do not see eye to eye, you will know for the AI Act that we want to prohibit both surveillance by biometrics in public space, the use of social scoring, which are things that you will find in the Chinese society.
Yes, indeed. Mass surveillance is an important feature of Chinese society, unfortunately by now, and it's of course done on a large scale with digital tools. Let's move on to, I think, our last topic, which is climate policy, and the role of competition policy and competition authorities in that space. And just to sort of remind ourselves, I mean, of course, in the Green Deal, a major aim is to increase investments into green infrastructure, green technology in the coming years, so as to reduce our emissions by 55% by 2030. The numbers we are talking about here are estimated by the European Commission, but also by other institutions, to amount to something like 2% of GDP, of which easily a quarter is done by the public sector. So there is definitely a question of the public sector supporting the rollout of these green infrastructure, green technology. But as soon as it does, there's a question: how do we protect the single market and the integrity of the single market and ensure the level playing field? Some are even worried that the Green Deal may mean the end of the single market, because countries will try to outpace each other by investing into some of those new technologies. So there is a real competition and state aid question. And of course, the European Commission, the EU, has already passed a number of important legislation in that space. And so perhaps you can give us your take on where we stand on that. And then you will have seen my colleague Georg Zachmann is already behind us. Georg Zachmann will give a few remarks, because he has a paper on the topic of competition and green competition policy and green investments that was just published today on our website.
Well, thank you. We could have talked about this in itself for hours with no end. Because the privilege to be part of this work now is, of course, enormous. Of course, the conditions are difficult because of pandemic, because we have war back in Europe. But also, this is maybe the first time that you have a willed transformation. You know, the first industrial revolution, it happened because of technology changed and there were different drivers, but there was no plan. Here, we're talking about a plan, a strategy to be climate neutral, for the planet to live up to the Paris Agreement. So it's a completely different thing that we are embarking on. And this also means that the state as such, governments and our democracy as such, plays a very, very different role. And this is why I think the framework that we set up for states to play this role must be a framework that enables everyone to play their role, and again, for the single market and for competition to be one of the helpers to achieve what we want to achieve. But I don't think that has ever been done before. And the ambitions, they are extremely high. That we want the twinning of the green and the digital transitions. We want that to be done in an inclusive manner, so that people feel that society is for them and that the social costs, they are absolutely minimal. Never been done before. If done in a state, that is small scale. This is big scale. And when we have seen sort of, hardcore full state involvement, it has been unsuccessful. If at least that is my view of some of the communist states back in decades ago. So embarking on this, the mix of private and public is really, really important in order to make it happen. And competition policy is a subcontractor in this respect. But everyone being in the lead or being a subcontractor needs to consider, what can we do to help? Because we're in a climate emergency, which makes, of course, the war and the energy crisis a huge challenge when it comes to that. So, as said in itself, competition is good for greening the economy in itself, if the framework that has been set up is the right one, like the ETS system, like legislation on environment, because we also have a biodiversity crisis, because that gives the drive for innovation and for implementing innovation. And that drive, we cannot live without it. That being said, we also need to enable a lot of investment. I think in particular when it comes to translating innovation into large-scale deployment. And I think here, public support plays a very important role to kickstart that process. So this is why we have passed the guidelines on state aid for environmental protection, climate and green energy. The new lovely abbreviation, the SEAC. Because that will help everyone see what can be done, and it's the same rules for everyone. Second, that we are in the process of making a new horizontal block exemption regulation with a specific sustainability chapter. It just came home from public consultation, so we're still assessing, but this has been very positively met. And what we can do is that we can invite businesses, groups of businesses who want to do sustainability agreements, and then assess in a balancing test, is this on balance good or not so good? But we are very careful because some of the comments that we got from the public consultation are also comments to say, be careful that you do not enable greenwashing, because that will just give potentially higher prices for consumers and lack of trust eventually if it's not credible. You pay more, but you don't get what you pay for. So here the balance is absolutely crucial. But also the antitrust work, I think, can play a role here. The best example is probably the fine on car manufacturers of nearly €1 billion for failing to deploy or to compete on the best emission cleaning technology. And here, you know, there was no trade-off. We increased market efficiency and worked to reduce harmful emissions. And I think that is a case in point. One of the things I see is that the circular economy is becoming a thing, because we see the first cartels also within the recycling sector, and that is probably a sign that it's taking off.
Wonderful. Let's get my colleague Georg back on screen. And Georg, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear well, and I listened with great excitement. I very much like the point of the competition policy being an important subcontractor of the transition, and I think we should really underline the word that it's important. And I was also fascinated by highlighting the complexity of the matter. As Guntram said, we just published a paper on that, and I mean, the aim of the paper was to essentially try to get a look through the complexity, and not entirely sure whether we managed, but the feeling is that it's an under-researched area, and also an area where policy can do more. The challenge that I am seeing is that more coming from the energy and climate field, we have all these big decarbonization models by the Commission, International Energy Agency, IPCC, and others. And those models typically assume a benevolent and efficient state and pretty well functioning market. So the allocation of resources in these models is essentially optimal, and even then the costs are quite substantial, and in terms of relocation of jobs and economic cost to society. Now we know that the reality will be much less efficient, and I hear a lot of calls for going for effectiveness over efficiency in terms of climate policies, because we need to get it done, and therefore better we do a second best solution quickly than trying to find the right institutions that manage these very complex trade-offs. Because as I see it, what we will need to do in the transition is completely rebuilding of our economic fabric. We will have to move a lot of people between sectors, between unproductive, dirty firms and green firms. We have to move capital. We have to change the behavior of consumers, and there is myriads of interlinked trade-offs to be done. And I'm quite worried that policymakers might still tend to prefer solutions like the taxonomy, which essentially says, okay, either a technology is green or is not green. And the world is not as simple as that. And therefore, I'm a bit concerned if we oversimplify the challenge and also undermine the role of markets in this. So my first question, if I may, to the Vice President, would be essentially, where do you see the biggest intellectual and political heavy lifting that is needed to design the institutions for the transition, and whether the Commission essentially has some strategic view on how it plans to complement decarbonization with competition policy tools, and whether essentially green or decarbonization goals might also count as an outcome of competition policy, or whether you will abstract away from the competition, from the decarbonization as a target, and leave that to the environmental policymakers. And then I would like to very quickly pick up one of the questions from the audience before, from the person from the EIB, because that's a topic that I find extremely crucial in the very moment. I think we are about to throw out of the window some of the institutions in terms of markets that we have been building for the past decades. The internal energy market, potentially on the ETS side as well, with allowing member states to subsidize energy consumption, and thereby pushing kind of entering into a subsidy race that will only make suppliers to Europe richer, but Europeans essentially poorer. And I would be very interested to hear your reaction on whether the Commission has any ideas and plans and tools to kind of undo the developments that we have been observing in the past months.
Thank you, Georg. Let's still collect a few more questions, one or two more, and then we have to stop. So I see the lady here in front and the gentleman in the back, and I'm afraid we have to cut because we have to leave. The Vice President has to leave in 5 minutes. So please, can we get a mic here in the front, please?
Thank you. Mrs. EVP Vestager, I'm Malin Burge from MasterCard, and I wanted to address the question around mobilizing European citizens in our pathway to net zero. And we've seen new proposals in the new Consumer Agenda 2020 aiming at empower consumers to make more greener choices. Where do you see the developments under your areas of responsibilities, not only enabling less carbon-intense production of goods and services, but which also further sets the market circumstances, encouraging businesses who can provide transparency and traceability on sustainable data and metrics towards consumers and citizens so they can make more informed and conscious consumption choices. We've seen together with colleagues, you've already shown a strong leadership in this area. One of the examples was the introduction of the repair score, obviously. But I'm curious to hear further developments that you foresee under your areas of responsibilities to enable this and to help reducing unsustainable consumption. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. And the gentleman there in the back, please.
Hello, Giacomo Zucchelli, A2A. First of all, thank you so much for being with us today. I have a very specific question for you, which is on hydroelectrical power concessions. We saw some infraction procedures launched by your services giving some impetus to national governments. So now we see some markets finally going, opening up, which is always a good news. But at the same time, we see other national authorities not proceeding this way. So on one side, my question is how the Commission intends to guarantee a level playing field within the single market. And the second one, of course, given the current crisis, how can the Commission protect European interest vis-a-vis predatory behaviors from third countries? Thank you so much.
Thank you. So I think that's all we can take in terms of questions, unfortunately. Vice President, you have... 3 more minutes.
Yes,
then-
I'll do my best. No, I don't have a good question on the last point of hydro concessions because some of these cases they are still ongoing. They're not only for us but also for other colleagues within the Commission. What is the long-term perspective is, of course, to have the hydro sector, electricity producing sector, work in a way so that more investment is coming in. Because then we could make much better use of the hydro resource that exists in quite a number of countries. But short term, I cannot go into detail because we have open cases. On the question of traceability for consumers, for the repair score, we find this to be very important, and it is not doable if we do not have businesses on board who have the ambitions to score what they do within their supply chain and to make all of that data available. Because in a data-driven economy, it should be possible to give consumers the insight as to whether their choices actually do have an effect. That doesn't change the fact that systemic change is what is absolutely needed, but we're just not in a situation where we can allow ourselves to say, no, citizens, consumers, they don't have to think about it, we'll just do systemic. No, but because the systemic depends upon every consumer also adapting to this and starting making choices that are more long-term. Could, for instance, be when it comes to things to be repaired, that you buy washing services rather than washing machines. And that is a change of culture to do one instead of another. But my guess is that if I buy a washing service, the machine installed will be much, much better than the machine that I buy myself. So I think this is really important. Second thing is that under the leadership of Maros Šefčovič, the Commission just launched today the Foresight Report 2020, and that is about the twinning of green and digital. Because we still have a lot of work to do in order for the footprint of digital to come down. Data centers, they now consume much more than aviation, or are responsible for much more CO2 footprint than aviation. So we need to decouple the use of data and digital services from the carbon footprint. Which is also one of the reasons why next generations of semiconductors is absolutely crucial, because that is what can make part of that come down. And then, of course, to start using the surplus heats from data centers in a much more systemic manner than what we do today. Because we tend to place them in places where we think it's cold, which means that they're reheating the entire area, where they could be put in places where the reheating could actually benefit households in district heating systems. So we have a lot to push for that. Then for the question of the EIB, what we have been trying to advise member states is to support the most vulnerable households, and to support them in a way so that they still have the price impact, but that they have the necessary funding to make a choice. Would I use my subsidy to make my house or my apartment better? Or would I use it in order to have a break from the effects of the price spikes? It's done in different ways, but quite a number of member states, they actually do make a preference to the poorest households in order to support them. Because for many of us, it's really important that you have the price signaling. Because even though energy prices for some has been high for quite some time, there are barriers to overcome in order to start improving your living conditions, or if you live in a rental house, to get your landlord actually to start improving. So the price signals are important, but in a social market economy, we also find that it's absolutely crucial that you can support the poorest households. We try to make all of these things temporary, like the temporary framework, which is actually temporary because it stops tomorrow. Temporary crisis framework, same thing, also temporary, because otherwise there is a risk that some of the measures taken now, they will be a permanent setback for fighting climate change. And we don't really have the time for that. Last but not least, on the first questions, I think it's a really good point to say that this giant transition will also have to transition our institutions. I'm afraid I don't have a really good answer as to how to do it, because the point is that we need to do so many things at the same time. One of the things that has been very encouraging for me personally is that the fact that we have war back in Europe has not decreased our ambitions. It has increased our ambitions. Increased our ambitions when it comes to everything greening, and increased our ambitions to get things done in the fastest possible manner. That has a lot of knock-on effects, but I think it's really, really important that we do not sort of seclude ourselves in sort of a permanent short-term emergency crisis mode, because then we will completely lack the vision of the changes that we actually entail every time we take a crisis emergency decision. We are part of creating that long-term success of what we want to achieve. And if we forget about it, then the risk is, of course, that we just, in the same place for a very long time, and we don't have the time to do that.
Executive Vice President Margrethe Vestager, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
It was really a pleasure to host you. Thank you so much, Margrethe.
And also, it
as director, but we will still have a big event in September, which is our annual meeting.
But you know what an honor to be bestowed on me? That this is the last thing you do. Thank you very much.